His bride arrived with a fevered infant, and no explanation for either of them. The baby made a sound like a caught breath, and then nothing, and that was what got me moving. I'd been standing at the door of the station house, watching the stage pull out, trying to work out what exactly had just happened to my afternoon. The woman, Clara, she'd said her name was Clara Holt, same name as the letters, was still on the step behind me. One arm wrapped around the bundle she'd carried off that coach, and the bundle was too still and too quiet, and she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the bundle. I turned back. "Inside," I said. She didn't argue. That was the first thing I noticed about her, not her face, not her condition, though both told a story, but that she heard the word, knew it meant business, and moved. Some people, when they're past a certain point of exhausted, they stop fighting the current. She was past that point. She came inside. I'd been Marshal of Cutter's Ford for 11 years by then. Before that, I'd ridden dispatch for the Army, kept books for a cattle operation that went under, done a winter of line work up in Wyoming that I don't much talk about. I was 51 years old. I had a house I'd built room by room over 6 years, a small remuda of working horses, and a vegetable patch that came in better than people expected. I had arranged, through a correspondence agency out of St. Louis, to meet a woman named Clara Holt who had described herself as a widow, 34 years old, capable, no encumbrances. No encumbrances. The baby was 7 or 8 months, I would have guessed. Small face, skin the color of old wax. It breathed in shallow pools. "How long?" I said. She set the baby down on my kitchen table, just laid it there on its back in its wrappings, and pressed both her hands flat on the wood like she needed something solid. 2 days, she said. Maybe 3. Started on the road outside of Laramie. Fever. Yes. You nurse it. She looked at me then, just looked. There was nothing in that look that was asking anything from me. It was the look of a woman who had been looked at too many times by men trying to figure out what she owed them. I moved past her to the shelf where I kept the medicine kit. "I need water," I said. "Clean from the well, not the barrel, pumps out back." She found the pump without being shown. I won't tell you I wasn't angry. I'd be lying if I said I took the whole thing in easy stride and felt only Christian charity. I'd been corresponding with Clara Holt for 4 months. 4 months of letters, careful letters, both of us, like people feeling their way across a dark room. She'd written about her late husband, gone 3 years, fever took him too, some pattern in her life I wasn't going to name out loud, and about her years in Ohio, the farm, her mother who died, what she wanted in a second life. She wrote plain and she wrote honest, or I'd thought she had. She hadn't mentioned the child. I spent the first hour not asking about it. There were things that needed doing and I did them. The baby needed to come down from the fever before anything else. I'd set enough bones and cleaned enough wounds over the years that I wasn't useless in a sick room. I'd never tended an infant, but a body is a body and a fever wants cooling. I got a cloth in cold water and wrung it and handed it to her and watched how she held the baby while she pressed it to its forehead. That careful, practiced hold, elbow locked. The heel of one hand keeping the little head steady, and I thought, she's done this before. She sat up with this child before. That made me feel something I hadn't expected to feel. I didn't have a name for it right then. She didn't explain herself that evening. I didn't ask. I heated broth and she took it without thanks and without apology, which told me she'd gotten past politeness hours ago. The baby's breathing evened out somewhere around midnight. I'd pulled a chair to the corner and was half awake in it, and I heard the change in the room, the small rattling effort replaced by something steadier, and looked over. Clara had her head down on the edge of the table, arms still crooked around the baby, asleep where she sat. I went out and brought in another blanket and put it over her shoulders and went back to my chair. The morning I would think about what it all meant. Tonight there was just this room, this lamp, these 2 people who needed something to hold. She told me in the morning. We were at the table with coffee. The baby was sleeping, still flushed but pulling through. I could see it. And she held her cup in both hands and looked at the grain of the wood and told me. The child was her sister's. Her sister Nora had come to her in January, 7 months along. Husband gone west and not coming back, no money, sick already before the baby came. Clara had taken her in. Nora had lasted 3 weeks after the birth. The baby was Nora's, was nobody's, was sitting in a box in Ohio with a woman who'd come to the end of her rope, and then had got on a stage to Wyoming to marry a man she'd written careful letters to. She looked up at me when she'd finished. Steady, that look. Not asking for forgiveness, not trying to read me. Just, that's the story, now you know. I should have told you in the letters, she said. Yes. I was afraid you wouldn't come to the station, that you'd write back and say no and I'd have. She stopped. I was afraid. I turned my cup in my hands. Outside the window my horses were moving along the fence rail, the bay looking for something in the grass. What's its name? I said. A beat her name is Ruth. I nodded. All right, I said. Let's see about getting Ruth some proper milk. There's a woman on the other side of town, Marta Bryce. She's got a baby of her own. She'll know what to do. Clara watched me. That's, she started. I'll hitch the buggy. Marta Bryce was a practical woman who had delivered half the children in Cutter's Ford and attended the other half and had opinions about all of it. She looked at Ruth, looked at Clara, looked at me once with an expression I chose not to examine, and got to work. An hour later Ruth was fed in a way that actually addressed the problem, and Marta had given Clara a list of things and told her what to do and when, and we drove back through the main street of a town I'd been marshal of for 11 years with a woman I'd met yesterday, and an infant I hadn't known existed 48 hours ago. I kept my eyes on the road. People will talk, Clara said. People talk about everything, I said. The stage comes in on Thursdays. Reverend Cass does weddings on Sundays. That gives us 3 days. She was quiet for a moment. You still want to, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I thought about the letters, 4 months of them. The way she'd written about Ohio in winter, the particular quality of that cold, the way the light came through the kitchen window onto the floor. She'd written about her mother's hands. She'd written about wanting a life that added up to something. I'd read those letters at this table in this house, and they'd sounded like someone who knew what quiet was and didn't mind it, who'd worked hard and wasn't finished working, who wanted a partner, not a keeper. I hadn't been wrong about that. I was more sure of it now than I had been 3 days ago. I still want to, I said. We married on Sunday, as stated, with Marta Bryce's husband as witness, and the Reverend's wife holding Ruth through the ceremony because Clara's hands were shaking. She'd been embarrassed about the shaking. I'd seen it and not said anything, which I hoped was right. There's a particular kind of shaking that comes from holding too much for too long and then being given, without warning, something solid to hold onto instead. It isn't weakness. It's the body understanding something the mind is still catching up with. The Reverend said the words, I said mine. Clara said hers, and her voice was steady enough. After, at the house, I gave her the room I'd set aside, the south room with the bigger window, more light, and I told her she could move things how she wanted. She stood in the doorway of that room for a moment without going in. Just stood there with Ruth against her shoulder, looking at the window. It's a good room, she said. It gets morning light, I said. She nodded, still not going in. Then, thank you, Eli. That was my name. First time she'd used it. I'd been hearing it for 51 years and it sounded different in her voice, and I'm not going to explain that further. Get some sleep, I said. Ruth'll wake you early enough. The first month was a negotiation, not an unfriendly one, more like 2 people learning the particular grammar of a shared house. She was in the kitchen before I was every morning, which I hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. I'd been feeding myself without complaint for years, but there was a difference. I learned this between feeding yourself adequately and eating a meal that someone made with attention. She cooked the way she moved, which was efficient and direct, no wasted effort. But something got into the food anyway. Some quality I couldn't name that made me sit at the table a little longer than I needed to. I'd built that table. I'd built most of this house. And it had been a good house and a quiet house and an empty house, and now it wasn't empty and I was still getting used to that, to the sounds of it. A woman in the kitchen, the small sounds of Ruth in the cradle I'd put together from a pine box and some cedar stripping, and I'm not going to pretend I found it easy right off. I didn't. I'd been alone a long time. Alone gets into you. But there are worse things to get used to. She didn't need much from me in those first weeks. That was the other thing. I'd half expected, I don't know what I'd half expected. Demands, adjustments, a long list of what was wrong with how I'd been doing things. Clara Holt, Clara Finn, now moved through the house like someone who understood that a house belonged to the person who'd built it, and she was careful with that. She asked before she changed things. When she moved the shelf in the kitchen, she told me why, and the reason was sound, and I said so, and she moved it. Small things, but they compounded. Ruth was better by the end of that first week. Full-cheeked, watchful. Those small eyes that infants have, still figuring out what the world was. I'd go to check the cradle before I went out in the mornings, just to see that she was breathing regular. And once I found her awake and looking up, and she looked at me with that wide, working it out look. And I stood there for a moment feeling something shift around in my chest without moving. I didn't mention this to Clara. Clara mentioned it herself 2 weeks later. She watches for you, she said, not looking up from the mending. In the mornings, she knows your step. I went out to see to the horses. I should say something about the town, because it's part of it. Cutter's Ford had opinions about most things, and mine was a situation with opinions attached. A marshal, 51, who'd been alone as long as anyone could remember, known to be alone, known to be satisfied with alone, coming in of a sudden with a wife and a baby, neither of which had been much discussed beforehand. There was talk. I knew there was talk. I didn't hear most of it directly, which was a function of my job. People tend to moderate their observations when the man they're observing wears a badge, but I heard enough. Enough to know what was being said, and by whom, and why. I let it alone. That was the right move, and I knew it. Town talk has a natural life, and you starve it faster by not feeding it. What I didn't let alone was the occasion, about 6 weeks in, when Ed Parr, who ran the feed store and had never much liked me, which was mutual and had been since before any of this, made a remark to Clara in the street. I wasn't there for it. She didn't tell me what he said. She came home from town a little quieter than she'd left, and when I asked, she shook her head and said it was nothing, and the way she said it told me it wasn't nothing. I went to see Parr the next morning. I want to be clear about what that conversation was. It was not a confrontation. It was 2 men in the back of a feed store, and I told Parr plainly what I'd come to tell him, which was that his opinion of my household was not something I was interested in, and that any further expression of it to my wife would be met with my full attention, which he was welcome to interpret however he liked. Parr was not a brave man. He heard me. He never said another word about it. When I came home that evening, Clara was at the stove. She didn't ask where I'd been or what I'd done, but when I came in, she looked at me over her shoulder, and there was something in that look, not gratitude exactly. Something older than gratitude. Recognition. The way you look at someone when they did the thing, the right thing, and you didn't have to ask and they didn't have to explain. I hung my coat, I sat down. She put supper on the table. That was a good evening. It was Ruth who broke things open. Not in a bad way. In the way that a window breaks open, the frame giving way, the air coming through. She was walking by then. That lurching, full commitment walk that babies do, nothing cautious about it, straight at whatever they're heading for. She'd taken a particular interest in the horses, which I'd been careful about. She was too young to be trusted around a full-sized horse, and I kept her back, but she'd stand at the corral fence and watch them with absolute serious attention, that small face set. I'd taken to carrying her to the fence in the evenings. I don't know when that started. It was just something that happened gradually, the way things do when you're not watching yourself. She'd hold the rail in her small fists and look at the horses and say things, not words yet, just sounds, and I'd stand there and I'd tell her their names, the bay, the grulla, the roan with the white foot I'd had for 8 years, and she'd listen. She listened the way she watched things, like it mattered. One evening Clara came out and found us there. She stood at the corner of the house for a moment, watching. I didn't notice right away. When I did, I didn't say anything. Neither did she. Ruth said something to the bay, who flicked an ear, and we both heard it. After a while Clara came and stood at the fence beside me. Her shoulder was close to mine. Ruth between us, still holding the rail, the three of us. The sun was going, the horses were settling. She thinks the bay understands her, I said. She might be right, Clara said. We stood there a while longer. It's hard to say when I understood that this was my life. Not the life I'd planned toward. I hadn't planned toward a life exactly, not in years. I'd maintained one, which is a different thing. But this specific thing. There was a morning in October, ground frost, light the color of tin. Clara was inside with Ruth, who had a cold, just a head cold, nothing frightening. But she was miserable in the way that sick children are, and Clara was patient with it in a way that I noticed, not for the first time, had no performance in it. Some people are gentle in a way that wants watching. Hers didn't want anything. It was just how she was. I'd come in for coffee and she was sitting in the rocking chair I'd brought in from the porch. She'd asked me to, the cold with Ruth against her chest. Ruth was making the sound miserable children make, low and formless, and Clara was talking to her. Not singing. Talking. Low, even telling her something, some long story in a low voice, and Ruth's sound was decreasing, subsiding, the way water settles. I stood in the doorway. After a while Clara looked up and saw me. She didn't stop the story. She kept talking to Ruth and looked at me over the baby's head, and that was the look. That was the particular look I have tried to understand since, and I will tell you what it was. It was here. It was, you are part of this. It was, I chose this and I choose it still, and I want you to know I know what I chose. All of that in a look. I'd been a marshal for 11 years. I'd gotten quiet telegrams about men I'd known. I'd stood at 3 different graves and said words I meant. I wasn't a man who made much of things. I'm still not. But that look. I came in and I sat down at the table, close enough to be in it, in whatever the room was holding, and I put my coffee down and I stayed there. Ruth's sounds quieted all the way to nothing. Clara kept her voice going, low and steady, longer than she needed to, and I sat there in my house in the morning with the frost outside and the light the color of tin, and I thought, this is the thing, right here. I don't need to tell you the rest in detail. It ran forward the way good things do, not dramatic, not even particularly notable from the outside, just accumulating. More evenings at the fence. Meals that got better, not because her cooking changed, but because we did, the way people do when they settle into a shared rhythm. Ruth walking and then running and then falling and getting up and doing it again with a look of such pure purposeful fury that I laughed the first time, which surprised me, because I'd thought I'd mostly stopped laughing. There was a Sunday that winter when a hard snow came in and we couldn't get to church and couldn't go much of anywhere, and we were in that house for 2 days, the 3 of us, and by the end of it, Ruth had learned to say something that sounded like Eli, not perfectly, not cleanly, but pointed in my direction, deliberate, and Clara had heard it and I had heard it, and Clara looked at me across the table with a look that had nothing complicated in it at all. Just that small sound in that house in the snow. Some things you hold for the rest of your life, without knowing you're holding them. You only find out later when you reach in and they're still there, unchanged. The way certain winter mornings are, that particular cold, that particular light, the sound of a child finding your name. I'm an old man now, and Clara is in the kitchen, same as she has been for going on 30 years, and Ruth is in Montana with her husband and 2 children of her own who call me grandfather, which still takes me a moment every time. People have asked me over the years, not often but some, usually men who knew me from before, how it happened. How a man like me, alone that long, ended up with all this. And I've never had a good answer for them, which is fine, because it's not really a question with an answer. What happened was, a stage came in. A woman was standing on my step with a child she hadn't told me about and no ground under her feet and nothing left to trade on but the truth. And I looked at those 2 people, this woman, this sick baby, and something in me knew what was needed, and I was the man who could provide it, and so I did. I didn't do it because I was a good man. I don't know that I was a good man. I did it because it was the right thing and I had the means and I was standing right there. But she chose me for it. That's the part I keep coming back to. She had no way of knowing what I'd do. She could have gotten a man who put her back on the next stage, baby and all. She could have gotten a man who made it ugly. She got me. And she looked at me that first morning over that kitchen table and she made her decision. And she's never gone back on it. I built this house room by room. I know every joint in it. I know where the floor creaks and where the window sticks and how the light hits that south room in the morning. And I know that none of it meant what it means now. Not until she walked through the door.